So I'm going to introduce you. Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming, for waiting for a few moments while we gathered people from the last Q&A and the last session in the theatre. I'm Hugh Thompson. I'm moderating this afternoon and introducing Mick Conefrey, who has written this wonderful book on K2, which comes hot on the heels of another equally wonderful book on Everest. And I think it's fair to say that Mick has made a great name for himself in mountaineering literature for reassessing climbs that people think they might know about, but in his capable hands he shows that they don't know as much as they think they did. He's going to give an illustrated talk to begin with about K2 and the events building up to the first ascent. I'm not going to give too many spoilers. And then I'm going to talk to him for a bit, and we'll be taking some questions from the audience. So, over to you, Mick.
Okay, well, do I have to use this microphone for your...
Yes.
I do? For the video. Okay, fine. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. I wrote the Ghost of K2, sorry. The Ghost of K2 about 3 years ago. I'd made a film for the BBC with the same title about 10 years previous, and I'd interviewed a lot of the people who were involved in the first ascents, because at that time most of them were still alive. Unfortunately, most of the people who I write about in my book are dead now, if not probably all of them actually. But anyway, so what I'm going to do is a sort of quite a rapid zoom through the history of K2, and then we can, if there are any questions, we can talk about that afterwards. So here we go. So where is it? Well, K2 is on the border of Pakistan and China. Most people who climb K2 climb from the Pakistani side. It is 28,261 feet, which means it's about 1,000 feet lower than Everest. A lot of people wonder, why is it called K2? How did it get this name? And this comes from the first surveys which were done of the Karakoram Mountains. The original surveyors, the first one was called J. Montgomery. He gave all the mountains K numbers. And so he would call them K1, K2, K3, K4. And then afterwards he would try and find out what the local names were. But because K2 was so remote, there wasn't a local name. And so that's how it got this name, K2. It's Karakoram 2. But that was also a kind of testament to why it's such a difficult mountain, because it's so remote. It's in a very remote region. This slide gives you a kind of sense of it. It's in the middle of an enormous zone of mountains, the Karakoram Mountains, surrounded by these huge glaciers, which are the biggest glaciers in the world outside of Antarctica, surrounded by other huge mountains. This is an aerial view. You can see that K2 dominates all the mountains around it, but there are lots of very big ones as well. When I made the film for the BBC, we didn't go to the top, but we went to the bottom, and these are some photographs I took of the approach march, which is very dramatic because the landscape around K2 is really quite extraordinary, incredibly bare, incredibly austere, very, very beautiful, but quite unlike the landscape of Nepal, which is much more verdant, sort of trees everywhere. Here it is bare, it is difficult, it's a very harsh landscape. This is a photograph of the bottom of the Abruzzi Ridge, the main route up K2 on the Pakistani side. And you can see that small huddle of tents, which is K2 base camp, which is a kind of godforsaken, miserable, freezing cold place where if you're trying to make an ascent of K2, you will probably spend several months there sleeping on this glacier, very cold, very windy, a harsh place. I've got a kind of very interesting number about K2. Between 1953, when there was the first ascent of Everest, and 2019, there have been 9,159 ascents of Everest. In the same period, there have been 379 ascents of K2. So there's 30 times more people have been up Everest than up K2. There is no yak route, as they call it, to the summit of K2. There are no photographs of queues of climbers trying to get to the top because it is a much, much tougher mountain. This gives you some kind of sense of it. The thing about K2 is that it's relentlessly steep. So it's not quite as high as Everest, but it's very steep. It's a mixture of rock and snow. The weather can be very, very bad. So it's a much more difficult climbing challenge. So in terms of the kind of history of the people who have taken up that challenge, this is a photograph of the first ever K2 expedition. This was it from 1902. It was an Anglo-Swiss expedition led by a British climber called Oscar Eckenstein, and he had two other British climbers. There were two Austrians, and there was a Swiss climber. The most famous of the characters from this expedition was undoubtedly Aleister Crowley, who became infamous as Britain's most famous Satanist. And he was known by the nickname that his mother gave him, which was the Great Beast 666. But he was a very keen climber in his youth, and was a participant in the first attempt on K2 and the first attempt on Kanchenjunga. So this is him at the end of the K2 expedition. He said he didn't wash for 85 days. And so this was his first bath. You can see how very emaciated he is. Needless to say, the first expedition to K2 in 1902, they totally underestimated the difficulty of the mountain and barely got off the glacier at its base. So they really they hardly did any climbing at all. They all got very ill. Crowley had malaria. Others had bad chest complaints. So they really didn't get very far at all. The second, and one of the kind of very important characters in K2's history, is the Duke of Abruzzi, who was an Italian explorer who, at the turn of the century, was one of the world's great explorers. He made attempts to get to the North Pole. He climbed in the Ruwenzori Mountains of Africa. He climbed in the mountains of Alaska. And in 1909, he went to K2, hoping to succeed where Crowley and Oscar Eckenstein had failed. And he came back with some amazing photographs because he had a character called Vittorio Seller, who was the world's greatest mountaineering photographer. And in fact, this is a photograph from the Duke of Abruzzi himself, but the photographs that they brought back showed this incredibly dramatic mountain. But again, like the Crowley expedition, they really didn't get very far up the mountain at all. And so again, K2 is just over 28,000 feet. They really got just to the sort of the bottom of K2, really. But the Duke of Abruzzi is a very important character because he came back with these photographs which were very inspiring. He came back with very good maps. He gave his name to the ridge, the Abruzzi Ridge, which eventually became the kind of main route to the summit. Nothing happened on K2 for another 20 years until the late 30s. If you imagine in the 1920s, the world was very gripped by all the British expeditions to Everest, and there was an increase in high altitude climbing. And so in 1938, the American Alpine Club got permission to climb K2, but first they decided to send a reconnaissance expedition out, and that was led by the character on the far right, Charles Houston, who was a student at Harvard, and he had done a lot of climbing in Alaska. It was kind of a tough, hardy character, and he went out with a team mainly of students. They were from Harvard, they were from Yale, There was one professional mountaineering guide, and their job was to do a reconnaissance of K2. They looked at a book by the Duke of Abruzzi, they looked at all of the photographs, and their job was to try and find the ideal route to the summit. They took with them hundreds of Balti porters who are kind of key characters in K2's history, because they were always the people who had to carry the equipment in. And they were surprisingly successful. That year, Charles Houston had very good weather. They managed to find a route to what they thought was going to be a good route to the summit. And it was all going very well until a couple of days before, until they got to a point at about 26,000 feet, 2,000 feet below the summit, and thought, well, maybe we're only supposed to be a reconnaissance, but maybe we can go all the way. And Charles Houston was high up with one other American climber, and they were getting ready to make an attempt on the following day. And they thought, well, let's have a bit of supper beforehand, and discovered that they didn't have any matches. And because they didn't have any matches, they couldn't melt water, so they couldn't drink, they couldn't cook. And they decided that it was just too risky, because at high altitude you need to consume a lot of liquid, because you have to hyperventilate, so you're breathing out a lot of moisture. So it's absolutely crucial to drink a lot of liquid. And so their attempt failed because of this, because of a lack of matches. But they had reached 26,000 feet, so now they're 2,000 feet below the summit. You've got to imagine that if Everest is 29,000 feet, the highest British party on Everest by this point had reached about 28,000 feet. So they'd done amazingly well on this expedition, which was only supposed to be a reconnaissance. In the following year, the main expedition came back, again an American expedition, but it was led by the bald-headed guy in the middle, was called Fritz Vasana. And he was a German who'd emigrated to America in the 1930s. And he was a brilliant climber. He was thought to be one of the best climbers in Europe, was undoubtedly the best climber in America, and a very driven man. But the problem was, it was 1939, and he couldn't find people who wanted to go with him. You know, the world was a dangerous place at this point. America didn't have a cadre of experienced climbers, and he didn't get on well with Charles Houston, who'd led the reconnaissance. So none of the people who'd been in 1938 went back in 1939. So Fritz Vasana was forced to put together a kind of scratch team where he had some of the people who were very young and very inexperienced, and some of the people who were very old and really not quite fit enough to be on the mountain. One of the more interesting characters was an American socialite called Dudley Wolf, he was quite a good yachtsman, and considered himself to be an outdoorsman, but I think his qualification probably was more that he had a big checkbook. And but Fritz didn't have much choice, because there weren't a lot of other people who were willing to go. And Fritz himself was, as I say, a brilliant climber, and he was basically a kind of leader who led from the front. And he established in the pattern of the day a series of camps, about 2,000 feet between each one, getting higher and higher up the Abruzzi Ridge, the same ridge that the Duke of Abruzzi had climbed, until he was at 26,000 feet, the same altitude that Houston had been in the previous year. But Fritz Vasana was a much more technically gifted climber, and a very, very driven individual. And so he went ahead, quite confident that he could reach the summit, climbing with one Sherpa called Pasang Lama. And this is a photograph of Pasang Lama very high up. Pasang Lama was a very good Sherpa, technically gifted. And Vasana got to a point at 27,550 feet, about 500 feet below the summit. And this was this was amazing. This was higher than anybody had been on K2 before. Not quite as high as I say that the British had got to on Everest, but nevertheless, he's almost at the summit of the mountain in a very dangerous, very technically challenging part of the mountain. But the problem was that the Sherpa he was climbing with, Pasang Lama, that he was very superstitious about climbing at night. And Fritz Vasana wasn't. He was used to, in Europe, he had climbed at night. It wasn't that uncommon if you had very good moonlight. And he wanted to go on, but his Sherpa didn't want to. And so Fritz eventually agreed that they would turn back and try again on the following day. But on the following day, when they tried again, they lost their crampons. There was a sort of a minor accident, and their crampons tumbled down off their rucksacks. And so Fritz was still confident that he could get to the top, but he had to descend down the mountain to pick up supplies and to get some new crampons. But the problem was that by this point, this expedition had become very fragmented, and Fritz Vasana was powering away, almost reaching the summit. Most of the other Americans were at the base, and they thought he was dead. They didn't realize that he was still alive, and they started stripping all of the camps which Fritz had built up on the way. And so when he descended the mountain thinking that he would be able to pick up supplies, there were no supplies. There were tents, but the tents were empty. There was food scattered around the tents, but there were no supplies, there were no spare crampons. So Fritz headed down to base camp. The problem was that the only other American who seemed to be able to cope with the altitude was Dudley Wolf, this non-mountaineer. And Dudley Wolf hadn't gone as far as Fritz had and Pasang Lama towards the summit, but he had stayed at a camp a few thousand feet lower down, I think about 25,000 feet. And when Fritz reached him, it was obvious that Dudley Wolf couldn't climb down with him. He just wasn't very good. Climbing down is much more difficult in some ways than climbing upwards. And Dudley wasn't in very good shape. So Fritz said, all right, you stay where you are. I'm going to go down. I'm going to get some more supplies. I'm going to come back up. We'll all go to the summit, and then we'll all come down together. But that didn't happen, because as Fritz descended down the mountain, thinking that he would find tents full of supplies, thinking he would find the rest of the American team, instead he found nothing. And so by the time he got to base camp, he found the Americans looking for his body, thinking that he'd been killed in an avalanche. And he was absolutely exhausted. And realistically, there was no way that he could make another attempt. But there was a problem now, because he's left Dudley Wolf, this other American, high up, who is not capable of coming down by himself. In the days that followed, there were 3 attempts to rescue Dudley. The first one led by Fritz, one led by another very experienced Sherpa called Pasang Lama, and one led by the only other decent American climber called Jack Durrance. But nobody managed to reach Dudley Wolf. And the Sherpas who got closest, well, the 3 Sherpas climbed up and they reached him, but he said he didn't want to come down. And the next day they disappeared in an avalanche. And so at this point, the American expedition was breaking up. The 3 Sherpas had disappeared. 1 member of the team had disappeared, but there was nobody fit enough to climb back up. So they went back to towards America and immediately started arguing about whose fault it was. And some people started saying, well, it was your fault, Fritz. You shouldn't have taken Dudley Wolf high. Fritz said, no, it was the other Americans' fault. They shouldn't have stripped the camps. And there were lots of arguments about exactly why this had happened. And it became a kind of cause célèbre. And there were lots of recriminations. The fact that Fritz Vasana was a German climbing in 1939 meant a lot of people kind of assumed it was a kind of Darwinian master race. And Charles Houston in particular, who never liked Fritz Vasana, was very critical of him, and particularly because his favorite Sherpa, Pasang Lama, had died, and he blamed Fritz Vasana for this. If there hadn't been all these rescue attempts, he wouldn't have died. During the Second World War, there was a break in climbing. So nobody climbed in the Himalayas. Everybody was busy fighting each other, obviously. But there were a lot of developments with equipment during the Second World War, because most of the major nations had mountain regiments, and they developed much better cold weather clothing. They developed plastic or nylon ropes. So there wasn't any climbing in the Himalayas, but there was a lot of work going on which assisted future climbers. In the 1950s, it was called the golden age of Himalayan mountaineering, because suddenly all of these mountains which had been unclimbed were climbed one by one. The first picture on the far right, I think it would be of yours, of the guy holding the ice axe in the air. That was the French ascent of Annapurna. In the middle, that's the British team who climbed Everest, and then Hermann Buhl, the German, who climbed Nanga Parbat. So a lot of the mountains that people had been attempting in the 30s, they succeeded on in the 50s. And in 1953, Charles Houston, who led the reconnaissance in 1938, came back. And again, he had a very strong team, principally American climbers, but one British climber, the guy with the blue anorak on the far left, called Tony Strother. And for the first time, because of partition of India, the Sherpas, who were perceived as being Indian because they came from Nepal but lived in Darjeeling, weren't allowed to accompany the expeditions. And so for the first time, you started having Hunza porters doing the work that the Sherpas had previously done. And the guy in the middle on the bottom row is Colonel Atta Ullah, who was the Pakistani liaison officer attached to the American 1953 expedition. The Americans followed the same route they had in 1938. This is Colonel Tony Strother with all the Balti porters who once again have got the job of carrying everything. They were a very kind of cheerful, cohesive team. That's Charlie Houston with his K2 umbrella, enjoying a little dip on the way in, I think, in a kind of thermal spring. They got to K2, set up their base camp in the time-honored place, and gradually started climbing higher and higher up the mountain until they got to a point at 25,000 feet. And they were feeling very confident. All of the American climbers were in this camp at 25,000 feet, unlike a lot of expeditions where people would be very much split into who the summit team is, who the support team is. All of the American climbers at 25,000 feet, feeling very confident that they're going to reach the summit. They took a photograph of themselves. They hadn't brought any flags. And one of them was a gifted artist called D. Molinar, so he painted a flag for them. And this one, if you can see, it's a bit hard to read it, but it's got the British flag, the American flag, the Pakistani flag, and the United Nations flag. And they were very confident that they would get to the top and started drawing lots for who would make the first attempt. But it wasn't to be. Instead of making attempts on the summit, they got trapped in a terrible storm for a week, and once again were unable to melt water, and so gradually became more and more dehydrated, weaker and weaker. And this photograph, rather blurry, but is the moment when one of the American climbers collapsed, and he was called Art Gilkey. And Gilkey was the youngest climber, very keen, but he developed something called thrombophlebitis, which was that his leg had swollen up, something which hadn't really been seen before in mountaineering. It wasn't a kind of known condition, but he basically couldn't walk. Eventually it went to both of his legs. Charles Houston, the leader of the expedition, was a doctor, and he knew that there was no chance that they would be able to get him down, but they were in this terrible position. They're at 25,000 feet. They've got a sick man. They know they can't get him down, and if they try and get him down, they'll probably all die trying, because this is a sort of, there's no international rescue is going to come and save them. And they tried to bring Gilkey down the mountain, but became involved in a terrible accident or a terrible potential accident where most of them slipped off and were held by one man, a kind of incredible moment in the history of climbing where it looked like almost the whole expedition would be wiped out because they're all flying down K2 at 25,000 feet, but one man managed to hold on to everybody apart from Art Gilkey, who disappeared in an avalanche. The American team made their way down, and they didn't bury Gilkey because they'd lost him, but they put his belongings in a little memorial, which is called now the Gilkey Memorial. This is close to K2 base camp, and if you go there now, you'll find it's covered in little memorials to everybody else who have died since. That was Gilkey's provisions box, the silver box on top. One of the American climbers called George Bell, he got severe frostbite after this accident, and he was carried out basically on the backs of these Hunzas and Balti porters. And when he reached, I think it was Rawalpindi, a journalist said to him, well, what do you think of K2? And he said, it's a savage mountain. It tries to kill you. And this phrase, the savage mountain, which subsequently became the title of the book, has stuck, and that's the name of K2. There's lots of books called K2 Savage Summit or Savage Summer. This is Charles Houston with his wife Dorcas, who had come out to greet him. He was deeply traumatized by the events, thinking that it was his responsibility that the youngest climber had died. But subsequently, history has been very kind to this expedition, because it's seen that they failed in an incredibly heroic way and tried their hardest, even though they did lose one of their men. Charles Houston became a kind of grand old man of American mountaineering and subsequently developed an interest in high altitude medicine and became a kind of world expert. In the following year, Charles Houston wanted to go back. He was convinced that he would be able to do it, and he wanted to go back. But on the way back from in Pakistan again, at the airport, he bumped into two Italians, and the figure at the front in the khaki shirt was called Tod Ezio, and he was a geography professor. And the man behind him in the white shirt was called Riccardo Cassin, who was known as a very brilliant Italian mountaineer. And because of the Duke of Abruzzi's expedition, Tod Ezio had a very strong sense that this was a mountain which had got an Italian history, and he was absolutely determined to climb it. And Desio put together a very strong team in 1955, principally of mountain guides, top Italian professional mountain guides, almost all of them. The ones who weren't were the kind of the top amateurs. And he set off for K2 saying that he wasn't going to make an attempt on K2, he was going to conquer it, and amassed an enormous amount of supplies. And again, Colonel Atta Ullah, the Pakistani liaison officer, he was assigned to the Italian team, and he had a strong team of Hunza high-altitude porters, and this was really the first time that the Hunza porters were expected to go high on the mountain. Although they'd accompanied Charles Houston in the previous year, they hadn't done the kind of work that Sherpas were doing in the rest of the Himalayas. But this time round, they had a very strong team. They had 5 kilometers of rope. So his idea was that he would build a staircase almost of camps like Fritz Vasana, going higher and higher up the Abruzzi Ridge, each connected by kilometers of rope, so that the climbers would be able to go up, come down, recuperate at base camp, go a little bit higher, come down. And the Italian, and this was a very successful strategy, the Italians marched in and set up their base camp in the same time-honored place, and gradually started building their ladder of camps higher and higher up the mountain until on July the 31st, 1955, they reached the summit. And I hope that this is some film that they took of... so this is the summit of Italian flag flying.
Achille Compagnoni e Lino Lacedelli hanno piantato la piccozza sul K2 il 31 luglio 1954 alle 6 della sera. In basso la notte già sommerge il campo base. Sulla neve della vetta il sole allunga per la prima volta ombre umane.
So the sun is shining on human beings for the first time.
hanno dovuto togliersi I guanti per legare le bandierine alla piccozza e le mani cominciano a non sentirle più. Si liberano
They couldn't
degli
feel their
inutili
hands
respiratori.
anymore.
Presto anche quassù sarà notte. Sulla cima della seconda montagna della Terra, a 8.611 metri, senza respiratori, sospesi sull'orlo di un paesaggio lunare,
commentaries saying that
due
they're there
alpinisti
without
sono
oxygen.
coscienti d'ogni pensiero, d'ogni gesto. La loro resistenza supera I limiti segnati dalla scienza alla vita umana. Solo ogni tanto gli pare d'udire una voce.
This is
come se fosse un
Compagnoni,
terzo a chiamarli.
the leader of the
Sanno che
Italian
le
climbing
altezze
team.
rarefatte danno sensazioni del genere. La macchina da presa è un blocco di ghiaccio. Ancora
Their
senza
cameras
guanti
were
per
like
liberare
ice
l'obiettivo.
blocks.
Bisogna fermare questo momento. Forse la voce che ogni tanto sentono non è un incubo, ma la voce del compagno se...
Okay, so that's the footage they shot. They had a small Super 8 camera, and whereas Hillary had taken a stills camera to the summit of Everest, this was the first film that was taken on at the top of this the world's second highest mountain. Amazing achievement. And oops, next one. Desio, the news came down to base camp, and Desio sent back a telegram to Italy, happy to announce the Italian conquest of the second highest mountain in the world on the 31st of July. And this was seen as a kind of major moment for Italian prestige. This is the headlines in Italian newspapers. The tricolour flies over K2. And the two guys who'd gotten to the top, Achille Campagnoni and Lino Laciadelli, were hailed as Italian heroes. They came back with severe frostbite, particularly Campagnoni, and had a terrible time getting down the mountain, and were very lucky to have survived. But they'd done it. And they got back to Italy, and Campagnoni fated as a great hero. And so K2 had been climbed, and the savage mountain had been tamed. But the problem was, within a couple of years, the Italian team was arguing amongst itself as to who was really responsible for the success of the expedition, how the money had been spent, whether they'd really used oxygen on the way up. And for the next 40 years, they argued about this ascent. And nobody really came out well from it, and nobody came out happy. And so that was the end of the story, but it wasn't a tremendous success in the way that the British Everest expedition, all of the climbers kept in touch with each other. There were tremendous friendships forged. Unfortunately, it didn't happen with K2. But in the years that followed, K2 gained a reputation as being the hardest mountain in the world, that it was the climber's mountain, that if you paid enough money, the theory went you could climb up Everest on a commercial expedition, but only true climbers could get to the top of K2. And this is an image of Ashraf Aman, who was the first Pakistani to climb K2 in 1977. I'll just finish with a statistic. I said at the beginning that there were 30 times more people who'd reached the summit of K2 than, of the summit of Everest than K2. But the other statistic is that whilst 370 people have reached the summit, 85 people have died. So that's a 20% attrition rate. If you compare that to the number of deaths on Everest, which is, can be pretty awful, it's 3%. So this tells you something about just how dangerous this mountain is. I'll just finish the last thing with a little bit of film that I discovered a couple of days ago, much to my joy, which I thought would be just quite interesting. All right, let me try and make this bigger. This is some film shot in 1909 of the, hang on a second. The 1909 Italian K2 expedition. So it starts and this was filmed by Vittorio Seller, and this is Rawalpindi in 1909, the first time So this is the second K2 expedition, and Vittorio Seller was a great, phenomenal photographer, but also he took a movie camera with him. And this is the Duke of Abruzzi and his team of crack Italian mountaineers with their pith helmets. Must be one of the earliest films in the kind of Himalayas, Karakoram Mountains. They trotted along on ponies whilst everybody else walked. There is a great film, if anybody's interested in, called The Invisible Footmen of K2, which is all about the porters who are kind of absolutely essential to expeditions, and you know, it's quite an amazingly hardy people. When I went to this is a great shot. This is a barge getting across the Baraldu River, and it was said to have been built for Alexander the Great, and was still in use, I think, even in the 1930s. And so this is again, this is the Abruzzi expedition, long train of porters. Because obviously you're going to this mountain for months on end, and so you're absolutely dependent on somebody else carrying in supplies. This is a kind of wonderful panoramic shot from Vittorio Seller, who was very keen on panoramas, and what would be quite amazing would be to go there now and repeat it, and I'll bet you would find that a lot of these glaciers are much, much smaller because of global warming. But this gives you a sense of the scale of it, you know, that the glaciers are endless, the mountains that surround them are endless. You know, this is completely different to the landscape around Everest, certainly on the Nepalese side, which is very verdant and rather luxurious, and it's only in the last couple of days before you reach base camp that you get into a much more harsher Himalayan landscape. Needless to say, the Duke of Abruzzi was very rich. He was something like third in line to the Italian throne. And so he was able to finance his expeditions, didn't have to worry about money, was able to get the best mountain guides. As I say, Vittorio Seller, then considered the best mountain photographer in the world. There you go, fine. Okay.
Thanks very much, Mick. Well, if I'll ask Mick a few questions, and then we'll take some questions from the floor as well. I think one of the fascinating things about your book, holding it carefully as product placement, the fascinating things about your book is how it reveals character, and that sense that one of the things that happens at high altitude when people become hypoxic and under stress is character is revealed, and particularly leadership. And you make some very good points and comparisons between the different leaders, Charlie Houston, Ezio, Duke of Abruzzi, even Aleister Crowley, early on. I particularly like the comparison you made that the Pakistani liaison officer who you mentioned, Mohammed Atta Ullah, who worked with both Charlie Houston and with Tod Ezio, has a very acute description of Ezio, which sort of sums up some of the problems in his character, which were revealed in the 1955 expedition. He has two personalities. Now the cool, calculating scientist, methodical, patient, precise, careful of the smallest detail. Now the intensely human man of action, freely indulging his moods in colourful speech and vigorous gestures. Like the friendship that developed between us, his many friendships were loyal and deep, but his few enmities were implacable and bitter. He was unusually kind, but he could be ruthless when he thought it necessary. And I think, I don't know if you'd like to talk a bit more about that, about how the leadership qualities reveal themselves on those different expeditions and how that played out, particularly in the aftermath, when praise with the Italian expedition wasn't really given where it might have been, and there were years of bitter controversy as a result.
Yeah, I think it's, that's what interests me about stories about exploration and mountaineering, is what happens when people are under pressure. Because when people are under pressure, you get the best and the worst out of them. And it's very interesting, as Hugh was saying, the kind of issue of leadership, because in terms of the K2 expeditions, you've got some people, Fritz Vasana, a classic leader, who leads from the front, but leaves everybody at the back thinking they've been abandoned. Then you've got Charles Houston, who leads from the middle and tries to have a very democratic team, tries to allow people to have their say. All of the climbers go up en masse. And then Tod Ezio, whose team ultimately succeeds, who is an archetypal person who leads from the bottom. He was, I think, in his mid-50s. By the time he went to K2, he did very little climbing. He wasn't a climber, he was a geographer. But he was a very, very good organizer. And he gave control of the climbing team to a guy called Achille Compagnoni, who was a very strong climber. But afterwards, when it all started falling apart, it was obvious there was such kind of mutual acrimony within the team that because Ezio wasn't in the middle of them, he wasn't one of them. He was very much sending his lieutenants out. You do this, take this man, go there. Compagnoni was very loyal to him, that it didn't have a kind of team coherence. And so when everything started falling apart, this was almost inevitable. And particularly when you compare it and contrast it to the Houston expedition, where all of the people who went on that expedition in 1953, stayed very close to each other. And, there's this tremendous, they call themselves a band of brothers, sort of forged in adversity. And, but on the other hand, Ezio was the person who succeeded in getting his man to the top. So you can kind of argue about, obviously from most people's point of view, they would prefer the kindly leader, the Charles Houston figure, who tries to get the best out of everybody. But that's not always the way it is. You know.
You've written a very acclaimed book on Everest before this, and now you've got K2, and you're working on Kanchenjunga, which is the third highest mountain in the world. Are you slowly kind of working your way down the peaks, and at what point will you stop?
I think that Kanchenjunga will probably be my last one, because it's I wanted to do the top 3 mountains of the world. But the trouble is that in terms of sales figures, you get very high figures for Everest. When it comes to K2, they're going down. And when it comes to Kanchenjunga, the book publishing companies are saying, well, we're not sure. So it's a little bit harder.
Is the book available in Pakistan? This one, the K2?
Is this one? I hope so. Whether it's legally available or illegally, I don't know. Having been to Nepal recently, I found a lot of pirated copies of my Everest book there. So no, but I'm sure it is. I'm joking about that. Yes, I hope so.
Yes, I was going to just open up the floor for some questions. I think we might need to pass out mics, actually. Is that right? So yes, we've got one for anyone who wants to ask a question.
I thought K2 was known as Mount Godwin Austen.
Right.
I mean, we were brought up on that it's called K2 for short because Godwin Austen is such a long name.
As I say, the reason it got its name, K2, comes from the original survey of it.
Yeah.
Godwin Austen was another British explorer come surveyor, and he got his name to the glacier in front of it, and his family liked to call it Mount Godwin Austen. Okay. And if you talk to his descendants, they will all call it Mount Godwin Austen, but that is not the name that has stuck. I think there is something about the kind of simplicity and the rawness of this name, which is so bare, K2, that fits the mountain. Because it's this harsh, bare mountain, and it's got this harsh name, you know. Alistair Crowley called it Choggaree, which I think was the local word for big mountain. But nobody was really convinced that this was a genuine local name, you know.
That is the Balti name.
Do they call it Choggaree? Okay.
Yes, that is the Balti name.
Yeah.
Great mountain.
Okay. I mean, there has never been, I think that, you know, there have been quite a lot of disputes over the name of Everest, because obviously Everest is a British name. The Nepalese name is Chomolungma, And I think the Tibetan name is Sagarmatha, or it might be the other way around. So there are lots of people who say, no, Everest should have another name, in the same way that Mount McKinley, the highest mountain in America, is now called Mount Denali. But with K2, I don't think anybody's ever had a serious campaign to try and get it having a different name.
Sorry, just one other thing, was that you mentioned the Band of Brothers.
Yeah.
It is suggested that Art Gilkey knew that, he was holding up their descent. And it is said that he cut the ropes and went down to save the others. And I was telling the gentleman about Dorcas Houston, who came to stay with us the 2 months that Charlie Houston was up in the mountain. And that when they heard that, there had been this avalanche and that they had all died, my father was really distressed, and he said to my mother, how can we tell Dorcas that, this is the end? And then he said, well, let's just wait a day or so. And then they waited, and the good news came that, the rest of them had survived. So,
Fascinating. Thank you. I think there was a question here, actually. Just if you wait for the mic for one moment.
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh. We'll come back.
Sorry, I thought that was absolutely fascinating. Could you just tell me, my ignorance, at what point, because it's also 20th century in terms of the mountaineering. I mean, you talk about the 1909 as the second attempt. At what point did they realize that K2 was that bit smaller than Everest, and that it was the second mountain, the second highest mountains in terms of surveying? Because if they hadn't been, they hadn't been mountaineering prior to that, how would you actually know? And sorry, the other thing is there only one route up K2? Because of course other mountains like Nanga Parbat, there's the easy route, the difficult route, and the really difficult route, but you literally only go up the one route with K2.
So the two questions. What's amazing is that if you look back at the measurements down of the Himalayas and the mountains of the Karakoram in the 19th century, in the 1850s, 1860s, how accurate they are.
That's really what I want to know.
Yeah, well, the British Survey of India set up enormous theodolites, frequently miles away from the Margit, the mountains they were measuring, and they came up with remarkably accurate measurements. And so I think that Everest was declared the highest mountain in the world in, I think, about 1856, sometime around that. There was a dispute which went on about whether Kanchenjunga or K2 was the second highest mountain in the world. And then subsequently people have revisited this. And I think it was in the 1980s, the Italian Tod Ezio went back to K2 with some GPS measuring systems, because a story came out that in fact K2 was taller than Everest, and which would have meant a major mistake, because we're talking about 1,000 feet, and because Desio had led the first expedition to the top of K2, he was probably thinking, great, if in fact it's the tallest mountain in the world, even better. And they remeasured it, and but no, yeah, I think these mountains are going up by inches, but not so much that Everest supremacy will ever be challenged. But in this kind of, in the 19th century, a lot of people thought that Aconcagua in South America was the highest in the world. There was a lot of disputes about this. But what's amazing is the actual measurements that were done by the Survey of India, just how accurate they were. There might be disputes over a few feet, but and since then there have been, now you've got much more sophisticated technologies, but it's quite amazing how accurate they were in the first instance, using what would be considered to be very primitive methods. Time for a last few questions. Yes, the gentleman here.
The 1975 expedition, the American one, Galen Rowell wrote a coffee table book in the throne room of mountain gods. I was an undergraduate in California, and we read through the whole book, and it's so politically incorrect. It has even named, porters, calling them Marlon Brando and somebody else, some other Hollywood star. We just were really pissed off with him.
Well, it's
Well, actually,
interesting.
can I just come in? I mean, is there a wider question there about how mountaineering culture changed from the 1950s and the heroic period you're talking about of Himalayan exploration, and then the 70s, which saw a wave of quite complicated climbs, often with tragic results, and people trying faster, lightweight ascents at times? I mean, is there a
And,
contrast?
You know, what has kind of changed was when Galen Roll went on this, there were 2 American expeditions to K2 in the 70s, and Galen Roll was a photographer, and he got everybody in the team to agree to give him their diaries, and he was going to write a warts and all book, and this American team was full of rivalries and lots of very ambitious people traveling with their girlfriends. So there was lots of scope for a warts and all book, and that's what he came up with. And this kind of style of the confessional book, where you admit all these rivalries, was something which was very new, but also something which was very different because, you know, in the kind of expeditions of the 1950s, in general, they were hierarchical. And so the leader of the expedition would very much say, well, you do this, you do that, whereas the kind of modern thing is everybody wants to make a summit attempt. And so it's a less hierarchical structure, less of a team sense. And as you say, this is the sort of his warts and all book because it sells, because this is maybe the truth about people under pressure. And you know, I've read a lot of the diaries as well as interviewing people from this era, and certainly there are things that they write in their diaries that they never would have admitted in public, and certainly didn't say at the time or in the books that they wrote subsequently. But at the same time, it was a much more genteel age, and that's something which is very different, you know.
Oh, there's a question there, actually. We just wait for the microphone.
Thank you.
Has K2 been climbed from the Chinese side?
I think the pattern that happened with all of these Himalayan mountains was that in the 1950s you had the first ascent, and then in the 1970s you had all of the other firsts, and so there would be people climbing from the Pakistani side, but in winter, people climbing from the Chinese side. Yeah, so I think pretty much every face has been climbed. But I think that the Abruzzi Ridge route is the most common route now. And again, it's going back to those numbers. We're talking about 350, 360 people. This is not a huge number, you know. And but that was the course of kind of mountaineering, because everybody wants to come back claiming a first. And so it would be the first. K2 has been climbed without oxygen now. In the 1955, when the Italians made their ascent, you know, there was an argument afterwards about whether the oxygen ran out just before the top. But now people have climbed under their own steam, absolutely, from the bottom upwards.
Thanks very much, Mick. I think we've run out of time there, but can I just say that Mick is going to be signing his books outside, both the Everest and the K2 book. I'm sure he'll answer any questions
I have a little question,
individually.
if possible.
Could we maybe do it as a private question? It's only just, I think, people need to get away. Can we just thank Mick? Thank you very much.